here with Doug Schneider, owner of Schneider Law. Thank you, Doug, for joining us today to answer some of the questions that we've had sent in.
Happy to be with you.
So basically, we've had a lot of people who are non-citizens, they're expats, they've lived in the United States for, some of them only a few months, but some of them have lived here almost their entire lives. And with everything that's going on, they're eager to get outside, they're eager to sort of become part of the movement that's going on in the world today. And I guess very broadly, from a legal perspective, are non-citizens allowed to take part in a peaceful protest?
Yes, every person who is physically in the United States has the same First Amendment rights. So regardless of your immigration status, you have the same right to free speech, the same right to peaceably assemble, the same right to attend protests. So the answer is yes.
Okay, so for all intents and purposes, if you hear some news about something that applies to an American citizen, that can sort of transferably apply to you when it comes to this realm of thing.
Yeah, it's not that there aren't risks, obviously, if you choose to protest and are not a U.S. citizen, but there is no distinction in the right to protest based upon your immigration status. And so you can protest, legally and peacefully for any issue that you want, provided that, you're not, deviating to, any type of violation of the law. The Constitution protects you regardless of your immigration status.
So if I go to a protest, it started peaceful and I'm starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable, things are sort of changing and I'm noticing things going on around me. Is there anything that you recommend people do? Is it just, turn the other way and leave, or should you be sort of observing any other checks before you go?
Well, I think the best practice would be to calmly leave any area that you believe could escalate from a peaceful protest. And I would not run, because running will catch the eye of authorities and can give them an independent reason to stop you. So I would walk calmly. I would also make sure that I survey the escape routes, because in a lot of these protests, the police are kind of surrounding people and not giving people an avenue to
safely
get out. So I think that when you get there to the protest, you should take stock of, where you think you might go if things devolve into something other than peaceful protest. If there is a place that you can go indoors as a last resort to separate yourself, you can do that. But I think you got to have a good sense to be able to recognize early the potential for things to escalate beyond peaceful protest.
Yeah, so it's really staying aware beyond just what's happening in the protest, and it's more having a look around, making sure you know your surroundings. If you're marching, sort of have a bit of foresight to see where you're headed and what's behind you to make sure you know what's next.
And it also, the buddy system is also a very good thing to do when you are planning to go to a protest. You should, to the extent possible, link up with more people that who are going, and kind of all have the same plan and be able to look out for each other. And this buddy system will kind of echo through a lot of the best practices that you and I are going to talk about.
So let's hypothetically say things do devolve and you are still there, or even if you're trying to exit, and a police officer, for example, comes over, you haven't been arrested or anything, and they confront you. What do people need to know? I sort of know that, I think I know in New York State, for example, you don't have to give identification or say your name. But is that correct? Or, what would you say if a police officer comes over to you? What should you know first?
Well, first you should know what your rights are, right? And you have the right to remain silent. You do not have to identify your immigration status. You have the right to film any interactions in a public space. But the important thing is that you should comply with an officer, even if what the officer is asking you to do it would violate your rights. The street is not the place to necessarily vindicate those rights. I think this is especially true for people that may have immigration consequences for doing so. So for myself as an attorney, my standing up for my rights is probably different based upon both my knowledge, my ability to talk with the police, and the different consequences that I would face. And I'll give you an example. I was leading a protest in Brooklyn, and an officer approached me and told me we had to cross the street. And I very calmly and politely told him, no, we don't. And we are in the same public space, and we're not going to do it, but we will work with you to make sure that, there is room on the sidewalk for people to pass, that we don't block the entrance to the location. And it worked, right? And that is, I think, not something that everybody can expect to be able to convince the police, especially in bigger protests with more potential for violence or agitation. I think that it's important to know what to do if you think your rights are violated by an officer. It is the best thing to do is obviously documentation. As soon as possible, write down everything that you remember, date it, so that you have a contemporaneous record. Photograph any evidence. If an officer touches you and you are harmed in any way, photograph the injury. And going back to that buddy system that I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you have contact information for any people who were witnesses. And so the buddy system makes that easier as long as you are together. But even if not, you should try to make sure that you get contact information for anybody in the vicinity that saw the interaction.
Okay, so at a first resort, don't engage with the police. But if you are engaged and they ask you, request you to do something, the easiest sort of to avert potential problems moving forward, assuming things haven't sort of escalated completely out of control, is to present them. Is that things like, if they ask for your license, is that something that you should hand over, or is it just sort of verbally saying your name and sort of say that's all I'm willing to?
Well, what I would say is in the first instance, you should certainly vindicate, attempt to vindicate and enforce your rights. So if an officer came to me and said, you can't film in a public space, I would say, officer, I am within my rights to film in a public space. And if the officer, told you to move, you should move. And if the officer told you to move again, you should move again, even if the officer's wrong.
Yeah.
And if an officer, again, like if an officer confiscates your phone, he grabs it and he takes it away from you, you should make sure that you document it, make sure you know who that officer is, and not fight on the street.
So it's basically worth, you take all the notes, and everything you do is just going to compile into something that they'd approach, someone like yourself. You can approach a lawyer later and say, here's everything that happened, here's all my evidence. That's a safer route than sort of contesting things beyond saying, I would like to acknowledge my rights here, but then if it really sort of push comes to shove, do as you're told and then take notes and pursue that later.
Yeah. Basically, the way I would sum it up is that I would make sure that the officer knows that I am invoking my rights. So, for example, if the officer approaches me and starts asking me questions, I would say, officer, I choose to remain silent.
Yep.
If the officer is not does not comply with that and exerts some type of force or pressure to get you to speak, the street is not the place to do that. Again, if you're video recording somebody in a public space and the officer says you have to turn that off, I would again say, no, officer, I have a right to video record in public. And if the officer, essentially makes it clear to you that he's not going to allow you to your right to record, the street is not the place to argue. You can compile it. In addition to perhaps seeking, legal representation after that, you can also make complaints with the agency. So that would be a civilian complaint, to the NYPD or what we call the CCRB, which is the civilian, report bureau that allows us to investigates complaints against cops. The Civilian Complaint Review Board.
Fantastic. So if sort of to keep progressing through this hypothetical, if you are arrested and you put in cuffs and sort of led away, what should you be doing? And again, we've got people that they're not citizens, and immediately I imagine the pressure is suddenly going to build because you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to impact me further. What do you advise people should do if they are arrested?
Sure. So there are certain very basic musts that any person who is arrested, whether an immigrant or a citizen, should follow. Number one, make no statements. Number two, if you are asked a question, you should say, "I wish to invoke my right to remain silent." You are not required to divulge your immigration status. You should not sign anything. You should demand your right to see an attorney. If you happen to go before a judge without an attorney, which happens in some locations at the initial appearance, you should absolutely not plead guilty to anything until you've had a chance to meet with an attorney. You shouldn't sign anything unless you've met with an attorney. And those are the most important things. Don't say anything, don't sign anything, don't plead guilty to anything.
So if you are arrested and you're taken back to a precinct, and they ask for some details when you're first taken in, should you be giving that information to an officer?
So the officer will ask you for pedigree information, which he has a right to, and you should provide, and that will be your name, your address, your date of birth, that type of information. If the officer asks you for identification, you have the right to not give identification. However, there are practical consequences to doing so, which is that an officer is not going to kind of move your case along until he can verify your identification. And if the officer thinks that you are not cooperating, then he's not going to be in a rush to verify your identification. And the most practical application of this is that for a lot of the low-level arrests that are occurring at protests, the arrested person is being given what's called a desk appearance ticket, which is essentially a summons to come to court to answer the charges at a later date. And that can happen, fairly quickly once they confirm your identity, sometimes, faster than 4 hours. However, if the officer can't verify your identity or is concerned about your identity and your truthfulness, he can process the arrest then and there and not give you a desk appearance ticket, in which case you'll be held until you can see a judge, which in New York is typically can take up to 24 hours. But in these protests, because of COVID and because the courts are operating virtually, the courts have been giving far more time before
to be held,
to be brought before them. And so you could end up being held 36 or more hours in some circumstances.
Okay, so pre-arrest, you've got a little bit more latitude and you can say, I'm exercising my right not to respond. Post-arrest, which you could still comply if you want to. Post-arrest, sort of name, address, date of birth, you'll provide them. And as much as you absolutely do have the right to not give ID, it's sort of a weighing up your rights with the practicality of the fact that you might be then held for 24 or 48 hours so that they can confirm who you are, which is obviously it's a huge thing to do. And sort of weighing up that whether you want to do that or whether you want to present ID and potentially sort of just process the thing.
And I think that the calculus is very different pre-arrest and post-arrest. Pre-arrest, the officer really doesn't. You have really no obligation to provide any of the pedigree information. Post-arrest, the officer has the right to take down your pedigree information and verify your identity for obvious reasons that you have to be entered into the system. So
the system, yeah. So before you go to a protest, what should you know about your sort of legal immigration status?
Yeah, I do think it's important that before you go to a protest, you just verify that your documentation is up to date. That you just make sure that there's no question about your legal status in the country.
And why is that? Sort of what can happen if you do sort of accidentally fall out of status and then you go to a protest and you're arrested? Does that changes things dramatically for you?
Yes, anybody who is lacks legal status in the United States for any reason needs to be aware that the consequences of an arrest are very different than if you have legal status. First of all, if you lack legal status and are arrested, it increases the chance that immigration authorities will catch up with you. And also, it's very important to understand that even if initially immigration officials don't catch up to you, the consequence of a conviction for a lot of things will be very different and have more drastic results for somebody who lacks legal status, where it is easier to expel somebody from the country than it is if you have legal status.
If you are approached by a police officer and they ask for identification and you decide that you give them the identification, I know that some licenses, like the New York State driver's licenses, include a bit about limited terms and have something about temporary visitor. If they ask for a follow-up, like, are you in the country legally, do you have to respond to an officer asking that kind of question?
You don't, and that is true both pre-arrest and post-arrest. If an officer approaches you on the street and asks you about your immigration status, you should say, I choose not to answer that, or I don't have to answer that. If in the post-arrest context, you should again say something to the effect of, I wish to invoke my right to remain silent. In addition to that, if you are asked at any point for identification, you should not be using. You're not required to use any type of immigration documentation or anything that suggests your legal whether or not you're in the country legally or without documentation.
So if you're planning to go to a protest, I think you and I talked before, and you had a great list of things that you should consider. So you've already considered that you've got legal status and you've made sure of that. The first thing you mentioned was a buddy. You mentioned the buddy system. So your recommendation would be, just as a precaution, you should always go to a protest with someone else.
Yes, I think that that really it helps you in many ways that we've already talked about, from having somebody to be with you in case you leave together, another set of eyes if you need to divorce yourself from a situation, having somebody with you to be able to witness any type of interaction. And also, if you are arrested and they're not, somebody who knows that you've been arrested and can contact, whether it's family, whether it's the lawyer, somebody that's going to be on the outside, so to speak, and able to assist you.
Awesome. The second one you mentioned was an immigration lawyer, a criminal lawyer or a lawyer's details. You should be carrying a card or some details.
Yeah, I think that it does make sense to carry with you, if you have one, a card of an immigration attorney, a criminal defense attorney. You can also look before you go for some of the civil rights organizations that are providing assistance. And one of the things that you can do with that is, going back to that buddy system, if you are going to be arrested, is you can give that card to the buddy and say, please call this person immediately.
And that is that's not a movie trope. If you do get arrested, you do get a phone call as soon as you get there. Or
no, that is like, you have the right to make one phone call. No, that's not really how it works. However, the biggest thing is that if a lawyer learns early that you've been arrested, okay, and you can proactively find out where what precinct that person is being brought to, would be very helpful. Okay, that lawyer can call proactively and say, I represent Josh. He is represented by an attorney. He should not be questioned. And if any questioning has started already, it should cease immediately. And so that is a legal protection, so that if by chance, after the lawyer has made that notification, you are continued to ask questions, those questions would violate your right to remain silent and your right to counsel.
Fantastic. The third one you mentioned was a phone or camera. Or phone and camera, I guess they're one device now.
Yes, and to be specific, unless you are a news journalist, which unfortunately we actually just saw the really egregious assault of an Australian news crew. You should not be carrying kind of professional grade video or point and click cameras, but a good cell phone that can take good video. Oh, also very important, make sure your cell phone is charged.
Yep.
If you have a small auxiliary battery or charging device, it's also not a bad idea to have that with you. Nothing large. You don't want to carry anything large, to a protest. And anything that could be misunderstood for any type of weapon.
Awesome. And just to confirm one more time, if you are on public property, you are allowed to film, as long as you're not getting in the way and as long as you're sort of standing clear of anything and disrupting anything, you are legally allowed to film anything you want, including police officers. That is a right that you have.
Yeah, if you are in a public space, you have that right. If in a private space or in a government building, that's very different. Most government buildings don't allow you to record. And in a private space, the owner can dictate the terms of recording. But in a public space, for example, in an outdoor protest, you have the absolute right to record anything in a public space. So even if the police demand you turn it off, or another person demands you turn it off, you don't have the obligation to do so. A lot of times the police will stand in front of you, to try to block you. Again, you have the right to move to the side. The most important thing is that you make sure that you don't interfere either intentionally or inadvertently with the police action that you are recording. And even if the officer tells you to move back, and you don't want to do so, you think that's unfair, you should nonetheless do your best to comply with the officer while still recording.
Fantastic. And the fourth thing that you mentioned that you should have on you if you're going to a protest is some identification. So I know I've read sort of some mixed information about whether you should or shouldn't, but it's sort of to keep the process moving in case you are arrested. It's handy to have that identification on you.
My position is this: if your identification doesn't reveal that you lack legal status in the United States, there's really no harm in having identification with you. Whereas there is the benefit that allowing the police to verify your identity much quicker. But if you have concerns about your identification, or the only identification you have reveals your lack of legal status in the United States, that then is a different calculus.
Absolutely. And I think we talked earlier about ID NYC is a great resource for people who want another form of identification that doesn't contain anything about legal status in the country. It's just a photo ID that has your name and address on it, and that's it. So that's a good option for people if they're looking for some form of identification. You mentioned a couple of things you shouldn't bring, and you mentioned one just before. So sort of the first one you mentioned just a second ago was anything that could resemble a weapon. What else? What other things should you sort of really reconsider taking to a protest?
Yeah, I would recommend that you not carry anything that's not necessary. So if you normally carry a group of keys, but you don't need all of them with you, I would bring just the keys that you would want to have with you. A house key, something like that. I would not carry a large sum of cash. I would not carry a large wallet. I would probably carry a small amount of cash and one credit or debit card. I would not wear jewelry. Don't wear a fancy watch. Don't wear a necklace, a ring. Don't bring anything with you that you would not want the police to seize and hold on to for a significant period of time if you were arrested.
Okay, so you may not see that again for some time if you're arrested with those items. Yeah,
a good example is there was just a really, really egregious arrest of a defense attorney who was recording police interaction, and just like we talked about earlier, they arrested her for what they call obstruction of government administration, interfering with the arrest, and now they illegally, in my opinion, confiscated her phone and are holding it as evidence.
Wow. So, okay. So yeah, a good tip. So take only absolutely what you need, nothing of great value, and nothing that can resemble a weapon.
Correct.
Awesome. So hypothetically, you're arrested. You contact your criminal defense lawyer. Is there anyone else that you think is really important to contact if you have been arrested?
I think that when you are arrested, you will discuss the charges with your criminal defense attorney, and as the case progresses, you'll need to consider the immigration consequences of any action that you take. So you need to know what the immigration consequences are if you plead guilty to a particular crime. You need to know what happens if you go to trial and are convicted of something And your criminal defense attorney is obligated to give you correct information about immigration consequences. But I still think that the best practice is to trust but verify. So to make sure that you've satisfied yourself that the criminal defense attorney is obviously competent enough to give the immigration advice. And obviously the best thing to do would be to verify it with an immigration attorney.
Fantastic. So you best bet, call the criminal defense attorney, have them like on their way kind of thing, and then you can discuss with them that you want to involve an immigration attorney would probably be the best course of action so that you've got everyone on the same page, sort of all pushing in the same direction.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for taking the time, and I sincerely appreciate you helping everyone out. I will put your details throughout this video and in some notes below so that if people are going on protests, they can write your number down or carry it on them so that they've got your details in case they are arrested and you are a criminal defense attorney who can help them out.
And this was a great conversation. I appreciate you having me on. And I will just say that it's great that we're having this conversation because it means that not just U.S. citizens are out on the street, demanding equal rights for everybody. And I think that's really inspiring.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you again, Doug.
All right. Thanks, Josh.